Welcome to the Shadows of Fear channel. Now I will guide you through a world of darkness, witches, and unknown creatures. I hope this helps you disconnect from your daily routine and relax. To avoid any visual distractions, we will leave the screen black and let your imagination run wild. Before we begin, write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your country. Now let's begin. Can an ordinary day become the beginning of the end? That thought kept circling in my mind as I stopped in front of an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It seemed as if time had left no mark on it. The wooden beams creaked in the wind, and the dust-covered windows remained silent, like guardians of forgotten secrets. There was something strange about this place. I could feel it. My name is Oliver. I've always been curious, but today, that need to discover something new pushed me to the limit. A voice inside warned me, "Don't go in," but I couldn't resist. Lately, I had heard strange things about this area, disappearances, unusual noises echoing through the night. No one wanted to talk about it. Why was it so important for me to uncover the truth? As I crossed the threshold, an eerie calm enveloped me. It didn't just drown out the sounds, it seemed to absorb everything around it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heart, which was pounding wildly. I hadn't come here just for answers. I had come to find a part of myself. I started looking around. The walls were covered in peeling paint that had once been a bright yellow. Scattered across the floor were remnants of furniture, fragments that might have once belonged to a warm, welcoming home. But now, this place seemed to whisper a warning. Stay away. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper. Barely perceptible at first, growing clearer with every step. I froze, listening. It was as if someone was breathing. A creeping sense of unease began to take hold of me. I couldn't convince myself that I was imagining it. But how could this be possible? Who could be here? The question gnawed at me, but the answer remained a mystery. I forced myself to focus. My goal was to find some evidence of what had happened in this place. Step by step, I moved forward, scanning my surroundings. The air felt thick, as if every molecule carried dark secrets. I advanced cautiously, each step echoing in the silence around me. The house seemed alive, whispering forgotten stories through its walls. I looked toward the hallway at the far end, where the light barely reached. What could be waiting there? Suddenly, a strange smell hit me. A stench of dampness and decay, a nauseating mix that made me wrinkle my nose. This place, which had initially fascinated me, was beginning to morph into something unsettling. Every shadow seemed to come alive. Every sound echoed like a scream in the night. I peeked into a room on the left. The air was colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. The room was filled with furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts waiting to be set free. I lifted a corner of one and found an old, dusty, worn-out armchair. Right beside it, a broken mirror reflected fragments of my image, distorted and terrifying. As I turned, I heard a louder noise, a dull thud. My heart stopped for an instant. Maybe it's just the wind, I thought, though logic couldn't dispel the growing unease inside me. With each step, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. I decided to move toward the end of the hallway, where the light faded into shadow. As I got closer, I noticed that the sounds of the house were changing. The faint whisper of the breeze morphed into muffled murmurs. What is happening here? I wondered, my stomach tightening. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but fear had already taken root. Finally, I reached a slightly open door. I pushed it gently, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, and scattered notes. Everything revolved around missing persons cases. A map of the city covered one of the walls, marked with red symbols indicating locations. Each mark felt like a silent scream, a desperate plea to be heard. Who had done all this? The atmosphere grew heavier. I glanced back. half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing, just shadows dancing in the dim light. Then, a sound that had been lurking behind my thoughts became clear. Footsteps. They weren't mine. Slow, heavy footsteps approached. No, I screamed in my mind, but my legs refused to move as if they had fused with the floor. The room darkened around me, and the air turned icy. The mixture of fear and curiosity shifted into pure adrenaline. I needed to get out, but the sound was getting louder, like a drum marking the rhythm of an impending doom. With one last look at the room, I turned and ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. My heart pounded as I searched for the exit. The house, once a maze of secrets, had become a lair of shadows lurking around every corner. The only certainty was that something was following me. Something I might never have been meant to find. I ran, breathless. The echo of my footsteps pounded through the hallway like a drum in a moonless night. Every turn, every corner became a new challenge, and the overwhelming sense of being hunted pushed me to move faster. What was that approaching? The question morphed into panic, and my thoughts grew more chaotic. As I rounded a corner, I nearly crashed into a closed door. Without thinking, I shoved it open with all my strength and stepped inside. The room was small, dimly lit by a sliver of light slipping through a crack in the window. But despite the light, the atmosphere felt suffocating, as if the darkness itself were trying to pull me under. The walls were covered in stains, indistinct shapes, as if someone had tried to draw something onto the worn-out plaster. I looked closer and realized they were distorted, terrified figures. A chill ran down my spine. What did this mean? Could they be the victims of the disappearances? As I explored the room, I heard a creaking sound behind me. I turned quickly and saw a shadow move at the edge of the light. My heart pounded in my chest. This can't be real, I told myself, but my survival instinct screamed at me to find a way out. In the corner of the room, I noticed a smaller door. I knew I had no other choice. I headed toward it, my hand trembling as I grasped the doorknob. The door creaked open ominously, revealing a dark staircase descending into the unknown. With every step down, the light faded more and more, leaving me in near total darkness. As I moved forward, the air grew heavier, thick with the stench of decay. A pressure settled on my chest, as if the place itself was trying to suffocate me. Finally, I reached the lower level. The walls were exposed brick, and the floor was littered with debris. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, covered in objects that seemed to have been there for decades. A stopped clock, a broken doll, and a worn-out journal. Without thinking, I stepped closer, feeling as if this journal held the key to understanding what was happening. I carefully opened it. The pages were yellowed, filled with frantic notes. The handwriting spoke of a secret community, dark rituals, and sacrifices. Each word sent a wave of terror through me, but I couldn't stop reading. The unseen, the forgotten. One sentence read, "We must feed them to maintain balance." A dull thud interrupted my thoughts. Someone was at the top of the stairs. Panic took hold of me, and I snapped the journal shut. But I knew I couldn't stay there. The shadows were closing in, and with them, the undeniable certainty that something terrifying did not want me to discover the truth. I bolted from the room, my feet moving on their own. I rushed back toward the staircase, but as I looked up, I saw a blurry figure peering down. The face was indistinct, but its presence was deeply unsettling. I couldn't stay here, my life depended on it. Reaching the hallway, I heard a whisper, an echo reverberating in my mind. "Don't go. Not yet." It was as if the house itself was trying to keep me inside, but I couldn't let it trap me. I moved quickly, feeling time slipping away. Every second mattered. The exit was near, but as I ran, the shadow followed, lurking in every corner, making me doubt what was real. Was it really a human being or something else? The line between madness and truth blurred, and my mind struggled to hold on to logic as terror consumed me. Panic coursed through my veins as I hurled myself down the dark hallway, the house's flickering light casting dancing shadows that seemed to come to life. Every creak beneath my feet was a terrifying reminder that this house was not just a place. It was a breathing entity, feeding off my fears. I could feel the breath of the figure behind me, cold and menacing, drawing closer with every second. As I reached a door, I pushed against it with all my strength and stumbled through to the other side. The room was smaller, but at least it was illuminated by a dust-covered window. The air was fresher here, though it still carried the scent of dampness and decay. Around me, shelves were filled with old books, some covered in cobwebs, others worn down by time. What secrets did those pages hold? Without stopping to think, I searched for something I could use as a weapon. My fingers landed on a heavy iron candelabra. Heart pounding, I lifted it, prepared for anything that might emerge from the shadows. Meanwhile, the whisper became clearer. "Don't run, you can't escape." I couldn't focus on that. I glanced back at the door I had come through, feeling as if something or someone was watching me. I knew I couldn't stay still. I had to find a way out. I turned to the window, my last resort. As I approached, I noticed it was boarded up, but desperation often drives people to do the unthinkable. I began striking the wooden planks with the candelabra. The wood splintered with each blow. Deep down, I knew my time was running out, and the sound of metal against wood echoed like the pulse of my growing anxiety. Finally, a plank broke, and with one last effort, I managed to open a small gap. I crouched down and tried to look outside. The drop didn't seem too high, but the yard was overgrown with weeds and shifting shadows. This was my only chance. Just before I jumped, I heard a noise behind me. It was a hissing sound, almost a whisper, but filled with rage. "Don't go," the voice screamed, freezing me in place for a moment. But my survival instinct took over. Without thinking of the consequences, I hurled myself outside. I hit the ground with a dull thud, but quickly scrambled to my feet. The overgrown weeds scratched my skin, but I didn't stop. I ran toward the edge of the yard, searching for a way to escape this nightmare. The shadows seemed to follow me, as if the house itself refused to let me go. The air was thick with a suffocating tension. I didn't know if the figure had followed me outside, or if it was trapped within its own labyrinth, but I didn't dare look back. Every step took me farther from that terrifying house, though its dark secrets still echoed in my mind. When I reached the front gate, I pushed against it with all my strength. It creaked open, and I stumbled forward, once again feeling the daylight on my face. But freedom was only an illusion. The feeling of being watched never faded. I turned to look at the house, and in that instant I saw a figure in the second-floor window. It was a face I didn't recognize, but its gaze pierced through me. In that moment, I understood that something far greater was at play here. The house didn't just hold secrets, it was something alive, something that claimed its victims. And now, it had marked me. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized that the nightmare was far from over. I had escaped physically, but the threat still lingered. What had I left behind? And what would happen now that I had opened that door? As I moved away from the house, one question echoed in my mind. Had I really escaped, or had I merely awakened something I did not yet understand? The fresh air outside could not erase the feeling of terror that had settled in my chest. Every step felt like a struggle, as if the ground itself wanted to pull me back. I glanced over my shoulder, afraid that the figure from the second floor was following me, but the window was empty. The darkness inside swallowed any sign of life. The path leading me back to the city was familiar. but the calm I once found in it had been replaced by a constant unease. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered: the newspaper clippings, the journal, the rituals, the idea of a secret community that had been active right under my nose. It was unsettling. How many people had fallen victim to this? And more importantly, who were the ones behind it all? Every sound around me seemed amplified. The chirping of birds, the whisper of the wind through the trees, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. It all became a symphony of unease, a warning that maybe I wasn't safe yet. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I felt someone watching me. I quickened my pace, trying to put as much distance between me and the house as possible, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. As I passed through the park, I saw a group of people gathered. Their faces were familiar, neighbors who would usually greet me, but now they seemed distant, wrapped in an air of conspiracy. I stopped, unable to move forward. "Oliver," a voice called from behind me. I turned to see Clara, a childhood friend. Her expression was filled with concern, and in her eyes there was something I couldn't quite decipher. "Are you okay?" she asked. I tried to answer, but the words felt heavy. "No, I'm not," I stammered, struggling to find the right words. "I was in the house. There's something very wrong there." Clara looked at me with disbelief, but there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze. "You shouldn't have gone. That house has a history many prefer to forget." Clara's words sent a shiver through me, and curiosity took hold. "What history? What happened there?" I asked, stepping closer. Clara leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a story of disappearances, of people who never came back. Some say there's a cult that gathers there and performs dark rituals," she said, her voice trembling, as if she feared someone might hear. "The people in this neighborhood have learned to stay away." A chill ran through me. It couldn't be a coincidence that everything I had found in that house matched Clara's words. But there was something more, something I couldn't quite grasp. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I asked, trying to process everything. "Because it's not safe to talk about it," she replied, glancing around cautiously. "There are those who watch, those who don't want the truth to be known." Her gaze shifted toward the group of people gathered nearby, and a feeling of unease settled between us. "What should we do?" I asked, feeling time slipping away. I needed to act, but the weight of the situation was paralyzing me. "We should go to the police," Clara suggested, though her tone was uncertain. "But honestly, I don't know if that would change anything. People are afraid to talk, they fear retaliation." Suddenly, a distant laugh interrupted our conversation. I turned toward the source of the sound and saw a man standing at the edge of the park. His figure was familiar. He was one of the men I had seen in the news, a suspect in several disappearances. The realization struck me like lightning. "Oliver," the man said, smiling in a way that sent a chill through my body. "Are you enjoying digging into old legends?" His stare was piercing, and I felt the air grow heavier around me. "Come on, don't pay attention to him," Clara whispered, frightened, but something inside me told me I couldn't ignore this. The man's presence was the embodiment of all my fears. "What do you know about the house?" I asked, my voice trembling with defiance. "Ah, the house," he said with a laugh that carried a dark undertone. "It's a place where lost souls gather, where those who can't escape are always welcome." Without thinking, I took a step back, pulling Clara with me. "Stay away," I warned, feeling my grip on the situation slipping through my fingers. The man's smile widened, and a sense of impending danger filled the air. I knew I had to act, to uncover the truth before the house and its secrets consumed me forever. But what price would I have to pay to unravel this mystery? As I stepped away, a feeling of determination took hold of me. The house had tried to keep me, but it wouldn't win. I had to go back. But this time, I wouldn't go alone. I needed to gather others, those willing to face the darkness. The fight was just beginning. Could this have happened in reality? Leave your comment, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a like as we continue our journey. What would you do if everything you know turned into a dark labyrinth? That question echoed in my mind as I walked through the streets of my city, a place that had once been familiar but now felt menacing. The flickering lights of the buildings reflected my growing anxiety, and every sound breaking the night felt like a warning echo. My name is Lucas, a 32-year-old journalist. I had always had a curious eye for the truth, but lately, that curiosity had turned into a kind of obsession. I had started investigating a series of unexplained disappearances in the neighborhood. It all began with an article I read in a local newspaper. The victims were ordinary people, individuals with jobs, families, normal lives. But as more cases emerged, the feeling that something darker loomed over the city became increasingly undeniable. Tonight, the air was charged with a strange electricity, as if I were being watched. Every shadow cast by the streetlights seemed to move, and the murmurs of passers-by turned into mocking laughter. As I walked through an alley, I heard a creak behind me. My heart raced. It's just my imagination, I thought, but a part of me knew there was something more. The streets that once felt welcoming now seemed like a hostile maze. The streetlights flickered, as if trying to warn me of impending danger. The air carried the scent of smoke and something else, something chemical. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease intensified. There was a whisper in the wind, a murmur that seemed to call me, pulling me towards something I couldn't comprehend. I decided I had to find answers. I returned to the office where I had left all my notes. The lights were off, and the silence was overwhelming. As I opened the door, a chill ran down my spine. The office seemed empty, but the air was thick with tension. I started reviewing my notes, searching for patterns in the disappearances. Each page contained details that seemed to lead me toward a dark truth. However, as I read, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I glanced at the window and saw a shadow pass by quickly. Was it real, or was my mind playing tricks on me? Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the office. I turned, my heart pounding. There was no one there. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. It's just the wind, I told myself. But the wind hadn't broken the glass. Something was wrong. I decided it was time to leave. I needed fresh air, clarity. But as I closed the door behind me, I felt something shift in the darkness of the hallway. The whisper had turned into a dull scream, as if the city itself was groaning. As I walked down the hallway, the lights flickered more intensely. The silence had become oppressive. The familiar surroundings of the office were fading quickly, and a sense of unease consumed me. Look at yourself, Lucas, I thought. You've lost your mind. As I reached the exit, a shadow flickered in the corner of my vision. I stopped. It was as if something was hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I turned my head slowly, and a cold shiver ran through my body as I realized I was not alone. A dark silhouette stood at the far end of the hallway. The figure moved, approaching slowly. I couldn't see its face, but the pressure in the air became unbearable. I heard a voice shouting at me to run, to get away from there. But at that moment, something inside me awakened. It was my job, my duty to uncover the truth. I turned around, ready to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. But as I did, a cold laugh echoed through the air. And in that instant, I understood that I had crossed a line. The darkness surrounding the city was no longer just a shadow. It was a tangible enemy, a dark force rapidly closing in. What was I willing to sacrifice to uncover the truth? The question became my mantra as I prepared to face the darkness. The air grew dense and cold, As the figure approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie echo that lingered in the empty hallway. At that moment, every part of me rebelled against the curiosity that had led me there. I stopped and took a deep breath, trying to calm my rising anxiety. The shadow didn't move. It remained there, an ominous presence waiting. The flickering office lights cast distorted shapes on the walls, and every shadow seemed to stretch, as if trying to reach something. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, only a heavy silence that felt like a shackle. I decided I had to act. I couldn't stay frozen. I slowly stepped back, searching for the exit, when suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was a tall, slender man, wearing a dark coat that seemed to absorb the light. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a hat. "Lucas, right?" His voice was deep and smooth, but there was a threatening undertone that made me step back. "I've been waiting to meet you." "Who are you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had come across this man in my investigation. "I'm someone who knows what's happening in this city," he said, stepping forward. "Someone who can help you, or make everything much worse." I felt the discomfort turn into fear. "Help me? In what way?" I asked, my voice trembling. "With the disappearances," he replied, smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "The disappearances are just the surface. There's a world you don't see, a dark side of this city that's hidden in plain sight. But if you want answers, you need to be willing to take risks." The conversation grew more intense, and the atmosphere in the cafe became charged with tension. I decided I had to keep investigating. After a while, I said goodbye and left the cafe, feeling that every step brought me closer to something bigger, something darker. As I walked through the streets, a troubling thought began to form in my mind. Was I really prepared to uncover what was behind all these disappearances? The idea of a cult operating in the shadows was terrifying, but I couldn't give up. The truth was my only salvation. I returned to my apartment, feeling the weight of the investigation getting heavier. I opened my computer and searched for more information about the rumors of the cult. Hours passed quickly as I read stories of people claiming to have seen strange things, rituals in the dark, and encounters with hooded figures. But despite the evidence, there was an air of disbelief. People feared being labeled crazy or, worse yet, becoming another victim. That's when I decided I needed more direct information. I remembered there was an online forum where people discussed these stories. I joined and began interacting with other users. Some talked about strange visions and disturbing experiences, while others shared conspiracy theories that defied logic. One night, as I was browsing the forum, a message caught my attention. "If you want to know the truth, go to the old mill at sunset." The warning froze my blood. The old mill was abandoned, and it was said to be a place frequented by those seeking answers. But it was also a place where many had disappeared. Adrenaline coursed through my veins. If I wanted to understand what was happening, I would have to risk going there. Fear mixed with excitement, and I knew I was on the verge of uncovering something that would change everything. As sunset approached, I left my apartment with my heart racing. The city was shrouded in shadows, and the atmosphere was oppressive. As I got closer to the mill, the sunlight faded, and a chilling cold enveloped me. The mill stood before me, its old walls covered in moss and shadows. I felt that every step I took echoed in the silence. Upon entering, the creaking wood beneath my feet broke the stillness, and a wave of unease washed over me. The place was dark, and a musty smell filled the air. I began to explore, searching for signs of life. The echo of my footsteps seemed to mock me, and every shadow felt like a threat. Suddenly, I heard a murmur. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart in my throat. The voice was coming from a room deeper inside. "Is anyone there?" I called, feeling my voice fade into the darkness. The murmur stopped abruptly. Silence became a deafening roar in my ears. I took a deep breath and cautiously moved toward the source of the sound. Shadows danced around me, and the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. As I peered into the room, I saw hooded figures gathered in a circle. Whispers reverberated in the air, and the environment was charged with unsettling energy. A chill ran down my spine. Unintentionally, I had ventured into the heart of the mystery I had been chasing. The truth I sought was closer than I imagined, but also more terrifying. I was ready to face whatever I was about to discover. The darkness was watching me, and I knew I had crossed a line of no return. The air in the mill was heavy and dense, as if each whisper from the hooded figures absorbed the light. The circle was illuminated by a faint flame that flickered, casting shadows that danced on the worn walls. My heart beat heavily, and a mix of fear and curiosity pushed me to move a little further. I watched the hooded figures closely. I couldn't see their faces, but their movements were fluid and confident. In the center of the circle was a table covered with a black cloth. On it, there were objects I couldn't identify: jars, candles, and strange symbols drawn with chalk. I shuddered when I realized I had entered a place where not only the truth was being discussed, but dark rituals were being practiced. A voice echoed among the murmurs. "The full moon will bring the change," said one figure, his voice deep. "The sacrifice must be made, and those who oppose us will be eliminated." My instincts warned me that I should leave, but curiosity kept me trapped. No, it can't be real, I thought. This is just madness. But deep down, I knew there was some truth in what I was hearing. At that moment, one figure separated from the group and headed toward the exit. My heart raced, and I decided to follow with the hope of gathering more information. The figure walked with determination, and I managed to stay close enough to hear their steps on the creaking wooden floor. We left the mill, and I realized that the night had grown even darker. The fog was beginning to envelop the area. The figure stopped in a nearby clearing, turning to face me. It was a woman, her face hidden by the hood, but her eyes shone with an intense light. "Why have you come?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but there was an air of authority in it. "I'm looking for answers," I replied, feeling my words barely escaping. "I want to understand what's happening in this city." She chuckled softly, and that sound was chilling. "Answers come at a price, young one. Not everyone is ready for the truth you're seeking." "I know there's a cult," I said, trying to stay calm, "and I know the disappearances are connected to you. Why? What do you want?" The woman took a step forward, coming close enough for me to see a scar on her cheek. "We want the purification of our society. Those who stand in our way must be removed. Every sacrifice is a step towards the freedom of this place." My thoughts spun quickly. Sacrifices, freedom. Everything I had heard in the cafe and seen in the mill began to make sense. But it also filled me with terror. "And the people who disappear, are they sacrifices?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Some of them are," she replied, her tone now firmer. "But others simply don't understand. There are those who must be guided, forced to open their eyes to the truth. The darkness does not stop, and those who refuse to see will be consumed." At that moment, a chill ran down my body. I realized I was part of a much bigger game than I had imagined. "What kind of cult are you?" I asked, feeling the urgency to escape, but my feet felt glued to the ground. "A cult that seeks balance," she said with an intense gaze. "We are not the villains people think we are. We are the bearers of a new order. But now you must decide. Are you with us or against us?" At that moment, I felt the fog thickening around me. as if the city itself was taking a collective breath. The decision I had to make was not just about me, but about everything I had uncovered. Every disappearance and every shadow in the night. What if I choose not to be with you? I asked, aware that my words might seal my fate. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. Then perhaps you'll find yourself among those who must be guided. The choice is yours, but remember, the truth may be darker than you imagine. As he spoke, a sound interrupted the conversation. A crack behind us. I quickly turned around and saw a figure emerging from the fog. It was the man from the hallway, the one who had been waiting for me. "Lucas, it's time to go," he said urgently. The woman looked at him with disdain. "And what do you know about the truth? You're just a spectator in this fight." "I know enough to understand that Lucas isn't ready for this," he replied, staring at me intently. "You need to get out of here. There's no time for doubts." An internal conflict took hold of me. I wanted to stay, get more answers, but I also knew there was imminent danger. With no other option, I decided to follow the man, running toward the exit as the fog closed in behind us. Once we were outside, the city seemed to have come alive on its own. The streetlights flickered, and a sense of unease wrapped around me. "Who are they really?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. "People who have let themselves be consumed by the darkness," the man replied. "But they're not the only ones. There are others working in the shadows, trying to stop them. You need to be careful. You can't trust anyone." His words echoed in my mind as we moved further away from the mill. Reality was becoming more complex and terrifying. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, unable to hide my distrust. "Because I see in you what others don't," he said. "You have the curiosity and the determination to uncover the truth. But you're also vulnerable. You need to prepare for what's coming." Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the quiet of the night. We stopped dead in our tracks, and my heart froze. "What was that?" I asked, fear invading every fiber of my being. "It's what happens when things get dangerous," he replied, his face grim. "We need to get out of here. The city doesn't forgive those who cross its path." With every step, the feeling of being watched grew. I knew I had crossed a line and that the search for the truth had led me to a place from which I could not return. Darkness loomed over me, and the question echoing in my mind was clear: could I survive what was coming? The air was dense and cold as I ran beside the stranger who had become my only hope. The echo of what resonated in the night seemed to grow closer, like a terrifying echo of what lurked in the shadows. I looked around, trying to catch any signs of danger, but the fog covered everything like a veil, hiding what was really behind us. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep calm, though panic bubbled in my chest. "We need to reach the refuge before they find us," he replied, not looking back. His voice was tense, as if every word could attract whatever was chasing us. "We can't stay here. They know you're involved now." My mind struggled to process everything I had learned. "Why did you choose me? Why didn't you go alone?" "Because not everyone can see what you've seen," he said, suddenly stopping. "You're a risk, but also an opportunity. The city needs someone willing to face the truth." "And what truth is that?" I asked, trying to stay focused on his figure. "There's a cult taking people, and something darker is lurking in the shadows." "Exactly? And that's not all. What they're doing has much larger repercussions than you can imagine. The entire city is trapped in a cycle of fear and control, but there are others like us fighting in the shadows." A sudden sound stopped us. A creak came from a nearby alley. The man raised his hand, signaling for me to remain silent. The tension was palpable. My heart pounded, resonating in my ears like a war drum. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its face hidden under a hood. I shuddered, recognizing the same silhouette I had seen in the mill. Is it one of them? I whispered. Stay still, the man ordered, his gaze fixed on the figure. Don't show fear. The figure moved forward, and the air grew even denser. I come seeking answers. It said in a resonant voice that seemed to flow like a whisper of wind. Lucas, you know you can't escape. The truth always finds its way. Who are you? I demanded, the courage I had feeling like it was about to fade away. What do you want from me? I want you to understand that you are at the center of all of this, the figure replied. What you witnessed at the mill is just the beginning. You cannot escape your destiny. My mind spun in confusion. Destiny? I just want to understand what's happening. Understanding it is your choice, the figure continued. But I warn you, there is no turning back. Those who know the truth must face it. Without warning, the man beside me moved, grabbing my arm and pulling me backward. Don't listen to their lies. They are trying to manipulate you, he whispered urgently. The hooded figure smiled, a gesture that sent chills down my spine. They are not lies, young one. They are warnings. The darkness you have touched will not stop. You have become part of this game, and it is time for you to choose your side. Lucas, we have to leave now, my companion shouted, breaking the spell of the figure. We started running through the streets, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the night. The figure stayed in the alley, watching us with an intensity that made me feel like I was being devoured by its gaze. The fog enveloped us, hiding the familiar streets that were beginning to seem strange and threatening. What was that? I asked, the cold air filling my lungs. One of them. There are more like him. They're everywhere, watching, the man replied, his eyes blinking with concern. We need to get to the refuge. There's no time to waste. Adrenaline pumped through my veins as we ran. Every shadow seemed to come alive around us, and the echoes of our fast breaths mixed with the sound of footsteps that could have been behind us. Fear of the unknown settled in my mind. Finally, we reached an old brick building. The windows were covered in dust, and the door creaked ominously as it opened. We entered, and the man slammed the door shut, making sure no one followed us. Where are we? I asked, looking around. The inside was dark, with furniture covered in white sheets. A sense of abandonment and neglect hung in the air. This is our temporary refuge, he explained, his voice a whisper. Here we can plan our next move and gather others who are willing to fight. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to notice the faces of other people peering out from the shadows. There was an air of distrust and determination in their gazes. Are they also part of the fight? I asked, feeling a bit more hopeful. Yes, the man said. Each of them has seen what you've seen. Each has lost something or someone. The city is trapped in a web of darkness, but together we can dismantle it. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The responsibility of knowing the truth was beginning to weigh on me. What do I have to do? I asked, uncertainty and anguish filling my voice. You must be prepared for what's coming, he replied, his tone grave. What we have discovered so far is only the tip of the iceberg. The fight ahead will be intense and dangerous. There are no guarantees. What if I can't face it? I asked, unsure. Then you must find your own truth, he said. Each of us has a role to play, and the decision of how to move forward is up to you. As the group began to discuss strategies and plans, a sense of urgency overwhelmed me. The fight for the truth wasn't just a battle against a cult. It was a confrontation with my own fears. What had started as a search for answers was turning into a struggle for survival. And in that moment, I realized I had crossed a point of no return. The darkness of the city hadn't just found me. It had awakened something in me that I could never ignore. The fight was beginning, and I was ready to face it, no matter the cost. Have you ever felt like you're being watched, even when you're alone? like an invisible shadow following every one of your steps, lurking in the darkness. No one else seems to notice, but you know something is wrong. It starts as just a feeling, like a distant whisper in your mind. But what if it's not just that? What if there's something there, something you can't see, but that's looking for you? It was an ordinary night when I realized something was wrong. The air was cold, and the city, usually bustling, seemed to be submerged in a strange and heavy silence. I was still awake, sitting on my couch, staring at the blank screen of my TV. I didn't care what time it was. Life seemed to stop in those moments of insomnia, when the mind moves faster than the body. I got up to go to the kitchen. The sound of my footsteps on the wooden floor created a series of hollow echoes in the empty air. The house had always been quiet, too quiet, and in that silence any noise became bigger, louder. I opened the fridge door, and the glow of the cold light made me squint. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A couple of water bottles, some food. I closed the door and returned to the living room. But something made me stop. A shadow, moving quickly, vanished down the hallway of the house. I froze. Was it my imagination? Had it just been a reflection? My heart beat faster. I cautiously approached the hallway, but when I reached the end, everything seemed in order. The shadows danced slowly across the walls as the moonlight streamed through the windows. There was nothing strange, nothing that could explain the cold feeling on my skin. Then I heard something, a low, soft whisper, but clearly present. I couldn't make out the words, just a murmur carried by the wind. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly turned toward the living room, but I saw nothing. The house was the same, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I began walking toward the living room, but as I did, I couldn't help but look back. Some footsteps, or at least what sounded like footsteps, followed me. Every time I stopped, the sound would fade, but it didn't take long before it started again. My thoughts were in turmoil. It's just the tiredness, I repeated to myself. It's just anxiety. But why? The air was so dense. Why did my senses feel so heightened to every movement, every sound? A faint smell of dampness filled the room, a scent I had never noticed in the house before. I moved toward the window to open it, seeking fresh air. But as I did, a shadow moved quickly in front of the moonlight, crossing from side to side like a specter. My breath quickened. What was that? Was I imagining things? Was it the tiredness, the loneliness, or was there something else? I looked again at the hallway, but now it seemed longer, darker. The moonlight, usually comforting, now seemed overwhelming, casting shadows that danced in an unsettling way. Something wasn't right, and even though I tried to rationalize the feeling of being followed, being watched, it wouldn't go away. My mind started to wonder, what if I wasn't alone in this house? I stood there, at the threshold of the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. The house, once so familiar, no longer felt safe. Every corner, every crack in the walls seemed to hide something, as if the very structure of the house was changing. The shadows stretched strangely, as if they were taking on a life of their own. Was my mind playing tricks on me, or was something really happening? I decided to step forward, even though my body trembled. The footsteps that followed me were closer now, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The sound of feet on the floor was clearer, more present. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't stop myself from looking back once more. There was nothing, but that didn't reassure me. On the contrary, the absence of something visible made the feeling of threat even greater. I continued down the hallway without knowing why. Maybe I hoped to find some logical explanation, something that would tell me all of this was just a product of my imagination. But as I moved further, the air became denser, more oppressive. The smell of dampness grew stronger, and something inside me told me I shouldn't continue. but I couldn't stop. Something pushed me forward. The hallway seemed to stretch, and the walls that were normally full of memories now appeared empty and gloomy. Every photo frame I passed seemed more distant, more foreign. The lights, which once softly illuminated, now flickered and blinked, plunging the house into an unsettling darkness. As I moved forward, the shadows seemed to move, as if taking on a life of their own. Suddenly, I heard a door slam shut at the end of the hallway. My body tensed. I knew there was no one else in the house. No one else was there. My thoughts started to swirl, a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What was happening? My legs moved without my control, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of a closed door, a door I had never noticed before. It was old, dark wood with an aged iron handle. It was closed, but something told me I needed to open it. An irrational but irresistible impulse urged me to touch the handle. When I did, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door creaked open with a low groan, and as it opened, the darkness on the other side seemed to swallow the light. The air inside the room was even denser, with a palpable weight that made breathing difficult. The footsteps following me were now clearer, closer. I could hear them right behind me, and a cold sweat began to form on my forehead. My mind struggled to find any logical explanation, but it couldn't. There was nothing that could justify what I was feeling or what I was seeing. Little by little, the light in the room began to distort. The shadows cast on the walls did not behave as they should. They stretched and twisted unnaturally. Something moved in the darkness. Something I couldn't identify, but whose presence I felt getting closer and closer. My breathing became faster and more shallow, and the sound of my steps merged with those other steps, the ones that couldn't possibly be mine. In an attempt to distance myself, I took a step back, but something stopped me. A cold, dry hand rested on my shoulder. It wasn't my hand, it was something else, something I couldn't see, but that I could feel with every fiber of my being. Panic seized me, and the terror of the unknown paralyzed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The hand squeezed a little tighter, and the room began to spin, as if I was being sucked into a spiral of darkness. The shadows grew denser, wrapping around me completely until I could no longer distinguish where I was. My mind overflowed, and one single question began to repeat in my head. What is this? A soft, almost imperceptible laugh floated through the air. I couldn't tell where it came from, but it froze my blood. I turned, searching for an exit, but the door was no longer there. Only an endless hallway of shadows remained, and the sound of my own footsteps that no longer seemed to be mine. The air was heavy, as if every breath took more effort than usual. My chest rose and fell quickly, but I couldn't stop looking around, searching for some explanation, some way out. But there was nothing, just darkness. The hallway, once familiar, was now a maze of shadows that seemed to move at their own pace, twisting and changing with each passing moment. My eyes couldn't follow the movement. They slid fleetingly and indistinctly, as if they didn't belong to this world. I forced myself to take a step forward, even though I felt something pushing me back. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should escape, but fear kept me in place. The walls, once solid, now seemed to pulse as if they were alive. The dark hues cast by the shadows constantly changed, stretching in unnatural ways. A penetrating cold began to rise along my back, as if the very air was becoming denser, more impenetrable. But the worst part wasn't the cold, nor the darkness, nor the shadows. The worst part was that I could no longer tell if the noises I was hearing were real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The footsteps that had followed me had stopped. Only silence reigned, but it was a terrifying silence. A void that seemed to consume everything, as if the sound itself was being suppressed by something lurking in the shadows. Where was the hand that had touched my shoulder? Where was the laugh I had heard just moments ago? Everything had disappeared, as if the nightmare had dissolved into nothing, but the fear remained, lodged in my chest like an invisible weight. A low whisper broke the silence. It wasn't a sound from outside or from inside my head, as if someone were whispering directly into my ear. The murmur was incomprehensible, but I felt every word as if it were piercing my mind. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped in an invisible web, a web that my mind couldn't grasp. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance, so weak that at first I doubted whether it was real or just a reflection in my eyes. But the light grew, slowly coming closer, until I saw that it was an old lamp hanging from the ceiling. But it wasn't an ordinary lamp. The light it emitted wasn't warm, it wasn't yellow, it was cold, pale, like the light of the moon, but more distant, more alien. My mind screamed not to approach, to run away, but my feet moved autonomously, as if something else was controlling me. When I reached under the lamp, I could see that I was not alone. The shadow that had followed me down the hallway was now beside me. It wasn't an ordinary shadow or a blurry figure. It was a clear silhouette, tall and thin, made of darkness that seemed to absorb the light itself. It had no face, no details, just an imposing figure that remained fixed at the edge of my vision, as if waiting for me to make the first move. The air grew even thicker. As if everything around me was becoming denser, the figure remained motionless, but something in its movements, or rather, in the lack of them, froze my blood. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. The footsteps I'd heard before were now a constant pulse in my brain, echoing with every beat of my heart. I tried to speak, to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. My lips wouldn't respond. Fear paralyzed me completely. The figure began to move, but not like a person. It was more of a glide, as if its body floated slightly above the ground, defying the laws of physics. Every movement was unsettling, precise, calculated. It was close, getting closer, and something inside me told me not to look, not to see what was about to happen, but I couldn't help it. The figure approached slowly, unhurried, as if it relished my terror. I stood there, watching, feeling time stretch as if it had no end. The figure stopped right in front of me, just a few centimeters away, and finally, something changed in its form. The shadow transformed, elongated, and I could see that it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something much older and more malevolent. It had no face, but I could feel its presence with an intensity that tore me apart inside. The cold light from the lamp flickered once more, and for a moment the figure ceased to be just a shadow. I saw something behind the darkness. A pair of eyes glowing with an unnatural gleam, a shine that did not belong to this world. My legs gave way, but I couldn't fall. Something invisible was holding me up, keeping me upright while the figure continued to stare at me. A murmur began to fill the air, but it wasn't a whisper. It was a distant, deep scream, coming from the very heart of the darkness itself. "What are you?" I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure if I had actually spoken the words aloud. I received no answer. The figure, like an echo of evil, began to slowly fade, but it didn't leave. It stayed there, right at the edge of my vision, while the darkness surrounding it seemed to devour everything in its path. Fear choked me. I was trapped in a nightmare, and I didn't know if I would ever manage to escape it. The darkness began to completely engulf me, as if time itself had stopped. I could hear nothing except my frantic breathing and the wild pounding of my heart. I was trapped, immobilized, and the figure before me, the faceless shadow, seemed to grow larger and larger. My eyes couldn't look away, though my mind desperately tried to deny what I was seeing. Every time I thought it would fade, the presence became denser, more tangible. An unnatural cold began to penetrate my bones, making my whole body tremble. Every inch of my skin stood on end, as if invisible hands were touching me. There was no logical explanation. The light from the lamp remained weak, as if it were struggling against something, as if the very light feared that shadow. But the light began to fade slowly, as if someone were blowing out a candle as it came closer to me. It was a dream. It couldn't be. The fear was too real, too present. I could feel the heat of my skin and the penetrating cold that seeped into every corner of my mind. The air was no longer air. It was something else, something dense that made every breath harder to take. My throat was dry as if I were drowning. But the worst of the fears was that deep knowledge. Something was waiting. Something didn't want me to move, to escape. Finally, the shadow seemed to move. It wasn't a glide or a figure crawling. No. The shadow rose as if stretching itself, towering above me, reaching a height I had never imagined possible. In its form, I could distinguish shapes, disturbing details. Not a face, but something else. A mouth without lips, just teeth, bones, and a macabre smile that pierced through me mercilessly. The eyes, those eyes that glowed with a shine that didn't belong to light, but to the darkness itself, weren't human eyes. They were empty, but filled with infinite malice. The shadow began to approach. Each step resonated in my mind. It was real. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand it. My mind searched for reasons, but every explanation I found seemed more absurd, more ridiculous. What could I do? What could I scream? There was no escape. I was trapped in a dimension I couldn't understand, in a nightmare that had no end. My legs, which hadn't responded before, now trembled, but not from fear, from exhaustion. The anguish had overwhelmed me, and all I wanted was to wake up, to escape. But the shadow kept coming closer, like a huge wave of darkness devouring everything in its path. I could feel its presence so close to me that my whole body vibrated with terror. And then, something changed. The figure no longer moved as before, gliding calmly. Now it advanced rapidly, erratically. Its movements were fast, uncontrollable, as if it were being driven by a force far greater than its own form. Each step thundered, making the walls around it seem to tremble. The shadow was no longer just surrounding me, it was touching me. I felt as though I were being absorbed by something invisible, something that devoured me without my ability to resist. But there was no pain, no physical contact. It was a void, a sensation of being stripped of my being, as if the shadow wanted to consume everything I was, everything I had been. I felt my own essence fading, my body growing light as if I were floating. My mind screamed, but no sound came out. Only that pressure remained, that feeling of falling into an endless abyss. And it was then that something broke the stillness. A scream, a desperate scream that came from the deepest part of my being. Something I didn't know still existed inside me. But the scream was not mine, it was not human. It was a cry of desperation, of suffering, of something that had been waiting to get out for a long time. The figure, the shadow, stopped for a moment, as if something had interrupted its advance. Its form twisted, but not in an organic way, more like something was fighting against its very existence. Suddenly, everything vanished. The shadow, the figure, the fear, it all dissolved into the air as if it had never existed. The light from the lamp returned to its normal state, bright and warm. The hallway, which had once been dark and threatening, now seemed empty. Silence, just silence. But something inside me knew it wasn't over. Something remained, something was left behind, and I couldn't let it go. The feeling of being watched returned, but it was no longer just a vague sensation. Now it was clear, palpable. I was being followed, hunted. And though the shadow had disappeared, I knew that somewhere in the darkness, it still lingered. The silence was deafening. The light from the lamp, which had once seemed fearful, was now the only source of reality remaining in the hallway. However, something was not right. I couldn't stop staring at the shadows projected on the walls, which stretched and distorted into grotesque shapes. There was something beyond the light, something hiding in the gloom, not quite disappearing. I forced myself to take a step forward. My mind tried to find some logic, some explanation for what had happened, but the more I tried, the emptier my reasoning felt. The figure, the shadow, had it been real? Or was it just a product of my mind, of a fear that had already consumed me too much? I was so confused that I couldn't even trust my own thoughts. My breath was shallow, as if I were still running through that endless hallway, but there was nowhere to run. I was trapped. The feeling of being watched lingered, as if there were no escape. I didn't dare look back, but something inside me told me that if I did, the figure would be there, lurking, waiting. I couldn't lose hope. I had to get out. I had to find a way out. Something that would return me to reality. Or so I thought. The footsteps I had heard earlier, which had stopped for a moment, began slowly again. Very slowly, but steadily. They were not human steps. They were not ordinary steps. They were heavy, as if something or someone was dragging a huge weight. Each echo made my heart race even faster. The walls seemed to be closing in around me, as if the hallway itself were holding them back. I whispered unintentionally, but the response came in the form of a new distortion in the air, a change in the environment that froze me completely. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, sliding across the walls with a speed I couldn't have imagined. The air grew dense, difficult to breathe, as if something were absorbing the oxygen in the room. I tried to move forward, but my feet wouldn't respond. The feeling of cold intensified. My fingers were stiff, my legs were shaking. The darkness, which had only surrounded me before, now seemed to enter me, invading, covering me. My muscles trembled, and in the distance I could see a figure moving at high speed. It wasn't the shadow, it wasn't the same presence, but something in its movement, in its form, told me that it was also part of what was chasing me. A kind of disfigured creature, seemingly made of fragments of darkness and broken light. An impossible being that glided effortlessly through the air, quickly approaching me. My body reacted instinctively, pushing me forward, running without thinking, without looking back. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I was running toward an end or another type of horror. I only knew I had to escape. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I could feel it. Something was chasing me, something that didn't want me to stay alive. My mind was crumbling. Every thought became blurry, as if reality itself were starting to disintegrate around me. I ran for what seemed like an eternity, with the sound of the footsteps getting closer and closer. The walls began to change, to deform. The light from the lamp was no longer constant. It flickered and faded, as if someone were extinguishing the stars of an endless night. In the darkness, I could see shadows move, slide, following me. The air was heavy, almost unbearable to breathe. And when I thought I couldn't go on anymore, when my legs began to falter, I saw a door at the end of the hallway. The door. I ran toward it with all my strength, not looking back. The sound of the footsteps was deafening. Every time I got closer to the door, it seemed to move farther away. But something inside me pushed me to keep going, with one last burst of energy. I reached the door, and with trembling hands, I opened it. What I saw on the other side paralyzed me. It was the same hallway, the same darkness, the same echoes, the same horror. I had been running in circles, trapped in the same place. The door wasn't an exit, it was an illusion, a trap set to catch my mind. The shadow was still there, waiting in the distance, and though I couldn't see it directly, I could feel its presence in every corner. My breath quickened even more. I was trapped in the place in my mind. And in that moment, I knew the truth. The shadow wasn't an external being. It was part of me, my fear, my desperation. Something had awakened inside me, something that had been asleep for years. And now I couldn't escape. I would never escape. Thank you for listening to our stories until the end. Now, if you haven't already, you can leave your like and subscribe. See you in the next episodes.